CCSE conversation. This is an initiative of the Centre for Cultural, Sport and Events of the University of the West of Scotland. The centre has developed from a collaborative partnership between UWS and Renfrewshire Council, and provides a space for collaborative research and development work that has local, national, and international relevance. And it is great to have today with us Dr. Freya Higgins, who is a senior lecturer in tourism management at the University of South Australia. And her work focus on social justice, human rights, and sustainability issues in tourism, hospitality, and events. And she has worked with communities, non-governmental organizations, and businesses that seek to harness tourism for sustainable and equitable futures. She's one of the founding members of the Tourism Alert and Action Forum, and she has won awards for engaged research, media engagement, and research and teaching excellence. And she was honored as one of the 50 most awesome tourism scholars in 2018 by the Women Academics in Tourism Network. And she is indeed awesome. And she is an absolutely inspiration to many academics around the world. And it's my privilege to have you and speak to you today, Freya. So thank you so much for joining us, even if I know it's a bit late in Australia just now.
Thank you, Sandro. It's wonderful to be with you again.
So Freya, you know, it's a challenging time for tourism, and you've been doing a lot of work around new ways of thinking tourism and a new theoretical framework of tourism. And you've been speaking a lot in different forums about your views of how tourism will change, and hopefully soon. So would you like to speak a little bit about the current work you're doing? It'll be lovely to hear, and for our people to listen about your ideas as well.
Okay, well, it's really nice to be with you, and I'd love to share some of the thinking that I've been doing. When I went into lockdown here in Adelaide, South Australia, I was very shocked by what happened with COVID-19 and the things that we took for granted that were suddenly stopped. So the sending of tourists back home, governments trying to deal with the threat of the pandemic and the public health issues of that by locking down the economy, and then seeing restaurants and pubs and all venues where people have entertainment and arts and activities being shut down. And then lastly, the border shutting. You know, I was really shocked by that because I had not imagined a world where all countries around the world would lock their borders down, and then without a certainty for how long that might be. So it's been a surprising time with COVID-19. And I think what interests me about it is because we've been complaining about the injustices of tourism, and particularly the ecological insustainability of tourism, as particularly we're facing climate change, that what we've seen is this moment of insight. Now, none of us who are looking at it for inspiration or insight are happy about the pandemic. And of course, we've lost hundreds of thousands of people, and there's been immense suffering. The loss of jobs has been tremendous. We have seen how important tourism and hospitality are to our economies. And so I'm not negating the fact that it's an awful thing to be going through. But the fact is we can make some good out of it by seizing the opportunity to question our choices. So that's what my work has been doing, is looking at the dynamics of what's going on and then thinking through what we might learn, what lessons we might learn in the aftermath of this.
It's interesting because obviously tourism and our human mobilities has been like a vector of the virus, right? Like the borders, like a world with so little borders, people flying, and the cruise ships, and the crisis on cruise ships as a starting point almost of the epidemics in many parts of the world. So we've seen tourism as almost responsible, or the frenetic tourism as almost responsible for a spread of the virus in communities, and in fragile communities as well, in places that, you know, coming from Brazil, we've seen the virus getting to isolated communities and indigenous communities, you know, and that you wouldn't have without such an invasive approach in our society. So is that something that you see in Australia as well? Or?
Yeah, well, the cruise ships became almost an icon of the pandemic for us because particularly we were impacted by a ship called the Ruby Princess. And it was a similar situation as what occurred in Japan with the Diamond Princess as well. And this thing that occurred where the ships have been offshore and then trying to unload the passengers as the illness was spreading amongst the passengers really showed how much we take for granted the coming and going of tourists and the handling of tourists. But I think the thing that really inspired me the most by making me angry and really super angry and still angry is the lack of care and concern from what I saw for the crew. You know, the crew number in the thousands on these ships. And so for the Ruby Princess, the passengers were let off quite quickly and without even proper testing or checks in that case. But the crew stayed on the ship. And after some weeks of difficulty where the Australian federal government said that they didn't want the crew coming off on our shores because we didn't want their contribution to our virus experience, which again, you know, that's a shocking indictment of our lack of care for people. And I think what COVID-19 actually exposes is whose lives matter and whose lives do not matter. And in tourism, we've often ignored that tourism actually does have a subtle statement about whose lives matter and whose lives don't. So these crew on these ships are an example of that. And as far as I understand it, there's still crew on the ships around the world that have been kept on the ships because the companies need them to keep the ships ticking over until they start up business again. And that those crew are unpaid in this time.
It's not only that. I think I have some friends in the cruise who work in cruise ships and things like that, and they said that also companies, they were choosing where they should take the ships because of the price of docking the ship, you know, and all these things. So they were like traveling these cruise members or crew all over the world because they had to go to somewhere where it was cheaper to then offload the stuff and fly them home or make them wait in the cruise until things resume. And that's the thing, is like there's almost an expectation that it will resume to normal life, and there's a lot of things about going back to normal, and it is difficult to see how that would happen in many senses, including in terms of consumer behavior, because we're talking about the trust that you look into someone and that person doesn't have the virus, is not transmitting the virus, or even when they get a vaccine, you need to trust that that person has been vaccinated, even more with the anti-vax movement that we have around the world. So, like cruise ships, but also the events industry will suffer with some kind of levels of trust between consumers and between organizations and consumption. So it will be interesting to see how it will unfold. And also the responsibility and how much responsibility these large corporations such as big cruise industry and companies will take for the spread of and for the significant number of people who died from the virus, is it not?
There's going to be a reckoning, I think, for those big cruise companies. I think you're onto a really interesting idea about this idea of the future being based upon trust, and it's almost as if I think we'll be traumatized. Many of us are going to be traumatized when we come out of this. And the purpose of holidays is to actually help you recover yourself, use recreation. You recreate yourself through your leisure and your holiday travels. And this idea of who's welcome and not welcome, because in the pandemic, we have seen tourist places saying they don't want people visiting because they are afraid of being overwhelmed. So the shutters have come down and the not welcome sign put up. So when we shift out of this, that will be the question about who do you trust and will it be more local? So we're seeing some of the people that are analyzing the possibilities after we get through COVID-19 as talking about localization as a reaction, and that perhaps being more socially and ecologically sustainable.
Yeah, and it's interesting because that's it. And we just booked a cottage in south of Scotland for September for our anniversary here. And I was speaking to my wife, and the idea that there is a huge numbers of COVID cases in the north of England, and that's a place where people from north of England go, is the south of Scotland, and you're thinking about, well, should I go there even if it's September? And that questioning of trust that the place won't be infected, and who are the tourists that are coming to the place before me, and who are the tourists who will be there with me. So I think, like, in terms of almost behavior and compulsory, just behavior of people in terms of gel and masks and trust would be really interesting in terms of how things will change in the future. But again, at the same time, I was speaking to another colleague and about how people will hopefully discover the history of their cities and their location, and that kind of bridges with you've probably seen on the news in Australia about the statue of Colston and the Black Lives Matter movement, and how actually there is a possibility that we will rediscover the meanings of statues and monuments and buildings in our own city and our own place. Taking the students out in Glasgow and seeing that most of them don't know the story of the story and the history of Glasgow, it's fascinating, and hopefully they will have the chance to visit their own locations and their own cities more. So I'd like you to speak a little bit more, about, you have two papers that have been published recently. One is Rethinking Tourism, and the other one is Socializing Tourism. And I would like you to talk a little bit about your views on that and the evolution of your thinking about rethinking and socializing tourism.
Okay. Well, I've been moved by the experiences of cities that you're seeing struggle with over-tourism before COVID happened. So Venice and Barcelona in particular are cities that have seen real difficulties for the local communities as tourism is imposed upon them. So my view is these companies, the big tour operators, the big cruise ships, work together with governments to actually impose tourism on these places. And the local people do not see the benefit of it in terms of economic benefits. And they experience the negative impacts in terms of their capacity to enjoy their own places and be able to move in the streets and enjoy the cafes of their cultures. And at the same time, also the negative ecological impacts that come off of this. And so some real criticism about that. And the vision that I had working together with you and a few other people came for me from teaching, where I'd been teaching a course on tourism policy and planning, and had repeated the definition of tourism that we often talk about, which talks about the businesses and the services, businesses that supply the services and the products to the industry, to make up the industry. And then you've got the motivation and the demand of the tourist. And putting those two things together between supply and demand, we have what is the tourism system. What really irritated me about that is that invisibilizes the local community. And in my view, and I'd said this in my teaching, the local community matters most because they cannot go somewhere else. It's their home where tourism is happening. The tourists can go elsewhere, and these big multinationals will go elsewhere if a place becomes no longer profitable for them. So to me, what matters most is this local community. The socializing tourism concept in the second paper just took that further and said that we actually need to understand the way that tourism now works in places like the European cities, here in Australia, in our tourism towns and so on, is as if tourism is the most important thing and it's a phenomenon that we should support. So the socializing concept is saying tourism should be put in its place so that it's serving the local society and its well-being and flourishing, rather than being a tourism end in itself. Because what we see with the promotion of tourism through things like our tourism commissions, our tourism bodies, is constant calls for growth and arguing that growth is good and making their metrics in the income and the jobs that tourism provides. And it's that way that we don't understand that tourism's actually situated within our society as one aspect of what makes our economy and our society thrive. And in a way, the push of the concept of tourism as an industry has made tourism an end in itself without reason to the local context, the local constraints. So, yeah, I've proposed an agenda on that to really socialize tourism. And I'll give you an anecdotal statement. In this time in lockdown, I've been fostering cats for a non-governmental organization that homes cats. And so that concept of socializing, I thought of the cats. You know, what are you doing with cats when you socialize them? You're teaching them to behave nicely and to be positive in the home that they're taken into. Well, we need to teach tourism how to behave nicely so that it makes our homes a better place.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's 2 points that it calls my attention in what you just said. One is how tourism as a field has been changed somehow, I feel. And I remember the first time that I started to hear about tourism, my background, my undergrad is in phys ed, right? So I was way more into sport and adventure sport, as you know, than tourism itself. But I used to, when I started to hear about tourism in Brazil, there was already a lot of talks about carrying capacity. And that's probably because of, you know, maybe the geography part of the regions of tourism, right? Yeah. And then suddenly, you know, as we progress, it's almost like the concept of carrying capacity disappeared from tourism literature somehow. And I'm not sure if that's a real feeling or not, and if you feel that as well. But it seems that being absorbed by the concept of economics and you know, volume of tourism and marketing and how you bring more tourism. So these all different external fields start to have more relevance in the study of tourism, which is marketing, economics. And the concept of geography and the concept of capacity and biology of the locations have been almost put aside.
Yes. And I have an example here in South Australia that a best practice model was created on Kangaroo Island, and they brought the tourism authorities into the discussion together with environmental organizations and community representatives. And at the beginning, they were looking at the limits of acceptable change model for carrying capacity. And South Australian Tourism Commission objected to that title because they didn't want the word limits. So what they've come up with instead was the tourism optimization management model. And at the beginning, it did have concepts of limits within it, but it changed over time as the tourism authorities became the dominant stakeholders in that model. So you can actually see it there. So there has been a change in the last 20 years where you really see this commodification, marketization, and privatization. You know, I'm concerned at the moment about pressures to privatize our national parks and our common areas for the tourism industry. So this is all part of the same trajectory.
Yeah, it just feels like, and I had this conversation with people in Visit Scotland here and in other organizations as well, that it seems that when you're talking about carrying capacity, we're talking about beds available in hotels and bed and breakfasts, and then the solution for that is you make more hotels and you facilitate the development of new hotels, bed and breakfast and things. And it's like, clearly, when you're talking about carrying capacity and the capacity of a location to host tourism, it's not only about the beds of hotels, it goes beyond that. It's, you know, and that's fascinating. The other thing that you mentioned before was the idea of education and the idea of educating the tourists about the location, the region, and the communities, and the, you know, the culture of the communities. So I would like you to talk a little bit about that and how you see the process of education, because I think before we've seen a lot of education that were signs where you tell the story in a big sign at the entrance of the city, and that's how you educate tourists. But I'd like to see your views about that as well.
Well, I'm old enough to remember when responsible tourism was stronger than what it is today. So there was a movement, and most visible in the UK with the non-governmental organization Tourism Concern, which I understand now is closed down. I don't think it's still operative. Here in Australia, I actually started out with what was called the Responsible Tours Network. And there were these bodies all around the world. And we did work to educate the market about their choices in touring so that they would ensure that their spending actually benefited the local economy, and thinking about the social and the ecological impacts of their tourism. So we even had it here where some of our national flights going to Bali showed videos before people landed saying, think about your impacts on Bali. And it even suggested things like bringing your plastic bottles and things back home rather than contributing to limited landfill on that island. That's unimaginable now. You know, that way of trying to make consumers aware and educated seems to be very unfashionable. And I think it's because we've gone more in that same trajectory as I was talking about privatization, commodification, and so on. The other aspect to this, and it's a libertarian type of belief, that we're all free to do what we want. We spend our money, we buy what we want. We don't get preached to or talked to. And you'll see some forces, you know, Jim Butcher recently wrote in Spiked magazine against some of my arguments, calling it a war on tourism, because this idea of responsibility is you're trying to get the tourists to change their behavior and be thoughtful about that and limit their behavior. And, you know, Butcher's right in one aspect, because when we say the old city of Venice is overcrowded and we're giving an idea to tourists to say, don't go to those key tourism sites, and particularly not in peak periods, we are trying to get them to change and perhaps become more thoughtful and less frequent in their traveling choices. So we are asking people to curtail themselves. But we do have to face the fact, you know, I come to this, and if I could say anything enough in this talk with you, of climate change, environmental limits, and the fact that we have ever more growing populations, and then populations that want to consume at a higher and higher rate, and getting an attitude of a right to things without being thoughtfully reflective of how that's not possible in the world that we're entering into. So there is something to this sides of the debate about freedom, consumer freedom, and that's free to be irresponsible if you want to be, unless the authorities are going to actually stop you, arrest you, and penalize you. And then on this other hand, realizing that the world is changing because humans are placing such pressure on finite natural environments. And I note the pandemic comes from human impacts on ecological environments that see us in contact with viruses that we otherwise wouldn't be. So if we continue going this trajectory, we're going to see more of this. And scientists have been saying this, it's a known fact. So, you know, we have a choice of freedom versus responsibility and caring for everyone. And it's very similar to the arguments we're seeing about the pandemic in the US, where you hear some Americans saying, you're violating my individual freedoms by saying that I should be wearing a mask, versus those that say it's a very little violation, very small violation of your privilege to just ask you to do that. And noting it's care for others. So we've got a real problem with that libertarian way of thought that it's me, my choice is me, I get to fulfill me. And I really see the selfie tourist as the ultimate image of the ego of this and the selfishness of this, versus saying we're in a world.
No, it's just interesting because I saw that people complain about wearing masks, and I wonder if it happened the same when people start to enforce people wear seatbelts. Because, you know, like when people had to start to wear seatbelts, and I remember that in Brazil when, you know, the seatbelt law came, that people were like, oh, you know, like seatbelt I don't like, it's not, but it's you know, it's not a choice. There are things that, you know, needs to be enforced for, you know, the well-being of the population, and, you know, that's why we have laws.
But there's a difference, Sandro, that it's care for the well-being of others. You know, the mask is about taking care of others. And with tourism, when we talk about responsible tourism, are the tourists now so selfish that they cannot care about the local community? Because to me, there's crimes that tourism does, and my work in the Tourism Alert and Action Forum has me attuned to this. And the worst crime that tourism does is it kills people. And we don't often talk about that. You know, the Ruby Princess, perhaps cruise ship coming here, you can show the deaths that have accumulated off of that. But the other main crime of tourism is dispossession of local people. And I feel this strongly about Venice. When you hear the story of the pressures of the day trippers and the cruise ships on Venice, is displacement of people that have lived there and their families have lived there for generations. Yeah. And the tourist could care less.
Yeah. No, yeah, I fully agree. And I think it's when you start to put that in perspective that, you know, tourism can kill people and can force people away from their home place and their homes. You know, and we've seen that in events literature, when we see like mega events and the dispossession of houses to clean spaces for mega events. We've seen that, you know, it's and in tourism is always been being hidden for too long. You know, the fact that, you know, there's not many Italians or people from Venice who own shops in Venice. You know, like the village from my grandma in Tuscany is owned by, you know, Americans and holiday makers that would come once every couple of years. So, you know, the village is half empty, you know, and is dying because obviously there is no community and people don't feel attached and it's very difficult to maintain. And, you know, as a historic place, it's very sad to see it going. So we're getting towards our final part of our talk, and I would like you to talk a little bit about some of the new initiatives that we've seen in the tourism in tourism research. And for me, it was beautiful to see the issue of tourism geographies being put together with so many critical papers and be made open access as well, right? If I'm not wrong, it's all open access, which is really unbelievable attitude, I think. So I'd like you to speak a little bit about the work that was done behind that. I think Alan Liu led on that, and you contributed to that. So it'll be interesting to see your thoughts about that.
Thank you. Yes. Alan Liu showed really great leadership early in the crisis of COVID-19 to call for people who were interested in contributing to a special issue on possible transformations in tourism. It was a group of people that had already come together to have conversations about transformational capacities. So I believe, if I remember correctly, that it was off of TriNet that those gathered who said, I put my hand up that I'm interested in transformations from tourism. And that pool of people then became the call for papers for the special issue. So Alan has his own commitment, and he's got this vision, which I think might be coming from a spiritual place, about global consciousness and transformations of global consciousness and spiritual ideas that we're all connected. So he led this and called for contributors to come through it. And the groups of papers that he gathered, many of which seem to be open access. I do want to query, though, there was one that I found today that wasn't open access, which I found funny because it was by Stephanie Benjamin, Alana Dillette, I think is her name, and I can't remember the gentleman's name. Alderman was his surname, three co-authors, talking about equity in tourism. And I think it will have been really relevant around the Black Lives Matter movement, because I know that those scholars are working around that. I believe they're all involved in Tourism Reset. So really great initiative in tourism. So I'm not sure why many of the papers are open access, but that one doesn't seem to be. Maybe, don't know. So beautiful work in there. I'm really impressed with a woman, Emily Crossley, who did a great paper, a very evocative paper about ecological grief. And I think what happened with these contributions is it was things that people were thinking about in lockdown, or even thinking about a longer time. On socializing tourism, I've been thinking about it for a while, and then made these contributions that really have spoken from their angles of concerns to make us aware of both the possibilities and the dangers. Some contributors were more negative than others. If I remember right, Michael Hall co-authored with two people that he often co-authors with, and he talked about the pandemic and tourism and pandemics, but then he cautioned, be careful what you hope for, because I think he thinks, or they think, that the shutdown is going to be really very difficult for people. And when we come back to possibilities of going back to normal, we're actually going to ratchet it up and it's going to be worse.
Yeah.
So his was one of the more pessimistic contributions.
And is that something that you think will happen? Is that something, because there is also a lot of talk on the media about the next pandemic already? You know, when the coronavirus crisis started, said, okay, there's actually other viruses that are really close to be transmitted to humans, and we may have another pandemic more often. Is that gonna stimulate or enhance or speed up the idea of less chance? Is that the last chance before a new lockdown? So I need to travel. And we've seen that. I think the CEO of Ryanair was on TV yesterday saying that, they had like 980 flights this week, 2/3 full. And you see like the volume of people trying to travel. And it just feels that, before there's a new lockdown, before there's a new spike, or before there's a new pandemic, I need to travel. And that concerns me greatly, in terms of behavior of people. Is that something that you feel that may happen as well?
Well, I want to shift, and I want to talk about the powerful and the wealthy and the corporates, that they are going to do everything they can to make money, and they are not going to respond to the call to the shift because they're too used to making money in the conventional way. Yeah. And I don't think anything good is going to come from them. What the tourist does is another issue. But I really think that we need to be thoughtful about their efforts to go back to business as usual, and particularly to continue to make money without being responsible for the need for us to change our ways of living to deal with climate change. And I don't think they're ready with that vision. And it actually is a threat to our future and our children's future. It is the most important issue that we have. So what I could see coming, we know there's going to be more pandemics. I think it's going to be a really vicious future where the emphasis will be on luxury travel and the rich will take care of themselves. So you might see some really perverse things like hotels getting rid of workers for robots, because they can say that takes the human threat out of it, and with no care for the consequence of the need for those jobs. We're going to see the use, and the Tourism Alert and Action Forum made a great statement about this, warning about what the real threats are. We're going to see more surveillance, more control. China, when it opened up Wuhan, was using the technologies for clear to go or not about whether you had experienced the virus or not. And there are people with the love of the technologies that they'll use it without a thought for ethics or humanity, just to keep the economies going. And then, of course, I said in this, some lives matter and some lives don't. We're actually seeing some countries, and we could name them, Brazil, the US, the UK, and possibly Australia. I don't think Australia so much, that are saying, well, we've got to open up the economy now. We've done lockdown. We will not do it again. So let's open up. And I really feel that there are some people that want to see people who are unproductive die.
Yeah, it is quite a scary approach that we've seen in some of the countries, and obviously coming from Brazil, it's really scary still with family and friends there in terms of that type of approach. Freya, will activism and will love and care for others, and you've been an active defender of injustice and human rights for many, many, many years, and is that a way that will save us?
The only thing that will save us is ourselves, to get off our asses and do something about it. I was really heartened by the Black Lives Matter movement and the way it took off around the world. and how injustices in place all around the world attach to what happened in the US. And people who don't normally come out onto the streets came out onto the streets in a pandemic because they knew it was important. It's very serious moments at the moment. In fact, police forces and militaries are preparing for actions against their citizens. When I talked about the technology before about surveillance and control, those things are getting worse, and the pandemic is being used as an excuse for it. So what my response to you is, we need to all get active, become protesters, get out to do things to make the change. And we've all motivated by our different commitments. You know, some people are about animal rights. We've seen the Black Lives Matter movement speaking very strongly about the injustices against Black Americans in particular, but, you know, non-white Americans. And commitments to things like climate change. You know, before the pandemic, the climate change activism had a lot of attention. What we really have to do is to stop being in our silos and start supporting each other. And I've seen it with the Black Lives Matter movement of solidarity with West Papuans, with people in Kashmir, with people in Palestine. There's a realization that those experiences of occupation are the same injustices and that there needs to be solidarity. It's possible, you know, that the Black Lives Matter movement could have said to Palestinians standing up and saying, you know, we experienced the knee on the neck as well. The Black Lives Matter movement could have reprimanded them and said, this is our moment. It's George Floyd that died. You know, you guys don't jump on our agenda. And they didn't. None of them have done it. They've all said these injustices are connected. And in fact, I think many of the injustices we're talking about are connected. But the thing is, you know, we've got limited time. You know, you've got young children, we've got jobs and so on. So it's hard to know what to put our energies into. But we really need to be looking at the connections and supporting each other and sharing energies. I think people in the US are actually realizing that. I think the Americans are realizing it.
Yeah, and it's important to talk, right? And it's important to keep talking and keep talking, you know. And that's the feeling I have. It's like I keep trying to talk to my students, making them understand the injustices that are caused by tourism. As you said, you know, if we look to tourism has been a source of injustice for many years, you know, because it became this neo-colonial practice that, you know, almost repeats in some level the same thing that happened with the colonization process of my country when the Europeans arrived in Brazil. So it's just been fascinating talking to you. I know that it's quite late in Australia just now, and you know how much love I have for you and for your work, and how much I appreciate all you do for the field. I just wish you, you know, that you can keep going. Please keep going, and keep inspiring the young generation of academics and new people coming and PhD students, because you do that, and keep fighting the good fight. And thank you so much for having this time to talk to us.
Oh, Sandro, I love your work too, and it's an honor to be here with you. So thank you, and thanks to the Center for making this opportunity possible. And thanks for everyone for listening. It's been really a lot of fun to chat to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Okay, take care.